Hello, welcome to FM Corner. I'm Danny Koontz, Director of Relationship Management for Windy City Equipment. Today, my guest on the podcast is Ed Crofton. Ed and I have been friends for a long time, and he is now a courting a hospitality headhunter for Gecko. Ed, how are you today?
I'm doing good. I appreciate you having me today. It's with, a lot of people get it confused. They call it Geico, but it's Gecko Hospitality.
Gecko. Sorry.
Like the gecko. No, that's no problem.
Yeah.
So,
I'm thinking about the little green guy.
Yeah, that's right. I think I've got one somewhere around here. I need to see if I can find it. But yeah, so been around for over 20 years. So.
There you go. Let's start a little bit about career. Talk a little bit about kind of where you started to how you ended up where you are today.
Okay. Do you remember when the first time was we met, Danny?
I don't.
Do you remember the Purple Palace?
Yes, absolutely.
When I joined Ruby Tuesday, that's our connection together. Those of you that are listening, is that, I worked for them for 29 years. And when I joined Ruby Tuesday, we had a meeting at what used to be our original building for Ruby Tuesday. When it started, I think it was 18 restaurants at the time.
Yep.
And it was where all the offices were. They also had a meeting room, and in the back was the commissary.
Correct.
And I met you when you started loading trucks. That's where I met you. And then look where you are today.
Loading trucks, going to school, and making quiche.
Right. That's where I did that.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I was originally from California, and my dad moved out here probably in the 60s. So we settled into a town outside of LaGrange, Georgia, which is about 70 miles outside of Atlanta.
Yep.
And typical thing when I started, I was a paper boy, and this was at the time, which a lot of people were, I'm showing my age, this was with the beginning of casual theme restaurants, like Fridays had just started, and, some of these other, what we consider, the casual theme. Mm-hmm. So our town, really, most of the restaurants that were there were either local or it was like the Moose Club or something like that. So, couple came into town and they opened up a restaurant. It was in an old inn. I was 16 years old and I started waiting tables. I was serving alcohol at 16 years old, and eventually was bartending. I continued working there when I went to college. And then I decided that I wanted to get into the restaurant business and be a manager. And I joined Steak and Ale. There was a concept that was their competitor that they bought out, called Le Chateau. I moved to Birmingham and worked with them for about 6 months, became a GM, and my old GM left and he went to join Ruby Tuesday. And he recruited me and interviewed with Sandy in the Purple Palace and Robert, and they made me an offer to come to Atlanta. And then they countered with Le Chateau with Steak and Ale, and I stayed on. And then I remember I had a bad shift and I called Robert, those of you may not know, the president of Ruby Tuesday.
Sure.
And I said, hey, I want to come join you. And he said, well, we can't do Atlanta. We can do Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So that's where I started with Ruby's and, went on from there. I think it was, my career was a little different than a typical restaurant person. It's kind of broken up into thirds. A third of mine in the original was operations, running a restaurant as a GM and multi-unit operator. And then through a restructuring, I was able to connive a job to come into training. And I went into HR and training and moved to Mobile, where our headquarters were, and eventually came back to Knoxville and, started at the corporate university and then went into HR. And then my job when I was with HR at the end was to find franchise partners for Ruby Tuesday. And I went into Robert and Sandy's office one day and said, hey, I want to move to Indianapolis and start a franchise. And so my last 10 years of it was with Ruby's. So really operations, then HR, then a franchise in my own business, and got the call one day, probably 13 years ago, that they were going to buy back all the restaurants from franchise. And I decided, they asked me to stay on. which I don't know if you remember, there were a lot of partners that were not asked to stay on.
True.
Stayed on with them for 6 months, and then I decided, I used Gecko Hospitality as my recruiting company when I was in the franchise, and the partner I worked with called me and said, "Hey, what do you think about becoming a partner?" And that's where it went from there. So I been with Gecko now for 13 years. I am a partner with them. Started out on the West Coast. If you can believe this, I live now in Indianapolis, but I was recruiting Northern California, Hawaii, and New Mexico for restaurants. Big time difference.
Sure.
I had like 5 different clocks in my office that would tell me the different time zones. Did that because I'm originally from the West Coast. And I did that for about 6 years, and then I moved into the hospitality division. And so I recruit now management for hotels, private clubs, event venues, things like that. Mostly focus in the Southeast around, of course, Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina. So I have clients that, I interact with that say they've got a need for maybe a sales manager or a chef or a, multi-unit operator, and I place them for them, and that's what we do.
That's great. You mentioned kind of 3 careers at Ruby's, but operations, HR, and training. How did all 3 of those, kind of help prepare you today as you're interviewing for people and stuff?
Well, I mean, I think it really, has helped me because I've got those 3 sides of operations. So I know the business. I know because I did it. I know what the qualities that they're looking for. So, which I've learned is pretty unusual. A lot of people get into headhunting, but they've never been in that side of the business. And they've got to learn it. So I know the business. I think that's one thing that helped me prepare. The second one was the HR side. So I was doing recruiting with Ruby Tuesday. And I was involved in that and understanding that HR side and the things that you can say and the things you can't say.
Sure.
We try to at Gecko not only be a recruiter or headhunter for them, our clients, but we also try to be a trusted advisor. So because of my HR background, I'm able to tell people like, hey, in this state, you're not supposed to run a background check before you make an offer. Or, hey, I think you might want to look at your training programs. And like the other day, somebody called me and said, could you send me a job description for a F&B director for a hotel? So I sent it to him. And then the franchise side was the business side of it. A lot of the people so I understand the franchise system. I understand being a partner. You buy into a system and there are guidelines that are set up. I've got a lot, and I think that has helped me as well. So hopefully that answers. I get for most people that, I know more about that franchise system than most of my other partners because they never were franchise partners.
And that's huge. That helps.
Yeah. So all of it, I think, is really a natural for me to get into this. I didn't realize it at the time, but,
Sure. Absolutely. You and I worked, you said 29 years at Ruby's. I worked 35. So we were there in the early days all the way through. What was something special about that time during your career at Ruby Tuesday?
I would say the culture, but mostly driven from Sandy, our founder, and Robert, who ran Ruby Tuesday. I mean, their door was always open. It was, you remember those times. Sure. It was, very personable. Robert was very approachable. Sandy, I think it was just that whole culture of having fun. We're here to, make money. We're here to take care of our guests and serve food, but we also want to have fun doing it. So I remember, all the meetings at BlackBerry and all that kind of stuff. There was always something fun that we were doing, whether it was running that damn 3K race. I remember the $50 bill they'd give us at the end. I don't know, in the original.
Remember that.
So, I would say that's, and when I started the corporate university for Ruby Tuesday, we were coming back to Knoxville, coming back to East Tennessee. Mm-hmm. I really tried to incorporate all of that culture into the university when people would come and visit. So that's what I would say.
I
Fun
think
place
that's,
to work.
I think that's great. People have asked, what was it like and so on. I said, well, I was very young. I didn't know what I didn't know. I just worked hard, as did everybody else. And that was kind of it. And I never had more fun doing it. When you mentioned Blackberry, I can remember the year, Sandy said, well, we're going to play tackle football. I'm like, are you crazy? We're going to lose half the people we got. Okay, we'll play basketball. Well, that was worse because, every time you
Yeah.
even took the basketball toward the hoop, somebody knocked you down. And then, okay, well, it's raining. We can't do that. We'll play paintball and shoot each other. Okay, well, fine. But those things and the enjoyment of it, and then you mentioned Ruby's University and so on, was a ton of fun because you got to spend time with lots of people, lots of them operators. I'm in the facility world. Those are my customers. Those are the people. That's who I serve, and that ability, and then to work for Sandy and Robert and others for that long a period of time was unbelievable. And
one of the things that was different about my career is, I go back and I look at some of the big pivotal moments with my career. I don't know if you remember back I think it was in the early 90s, there was a big downsizing where we went in and we started these regional offices, and in that process, my job was eliminated. I don't know if you remember that. I got downsized, and it gave me an opportunity to try to, talk to Eric Paul, who was one of my mentors, and say, hey, listen, what do you think about me coming to work with you and trying to help you in this process for his region? So I came on board, which, I was probably one of the first operational people that came into headquarters support. And I think up until then, what it made people realize is the only progression at that point to move forward with the company was to be in operations. If you were in operations, you were in operations. Where at that time, we came to the point where Sandy said, we need to get some of these operational people in our support so they can relate better. So I think that I set a pathway. So if you look at all those people like Richard, who you just did something with, all of that I believe was created because I really pushed that for people to come in from operations and do that. So
I was just thinking of all the people that were in operations, people like Scoggins, Dominic. There's tons.
But when we started up until probably the early 90s, there wasn't really that many operational people in support.
Correct. Absolutely. What are 2 or 3 things you kind of look for, Ed, in the people that you interview? What do they have to have for you?
Well, one of the things that was difficult for me is that when I was at Ruby's and I was interviewing people, I was face to face with people. In my role today, now that's changed with Zoom and Teams, that I usually don't see the person. So I tell people that when you're interviewing, there's certain senses that you have. One is sight, one is hearing, listening to them. You look at the resume, all that kind of stuff. I don't have the sight piece anymore. So I look out for other things like, example, their resume. I think in today's world, it's a lot different when you and I were looking for jobs. It was, you get the resume, you mail it, you fax it, and there was no internet, there was no Indeed, there was no LinkedIn. So one of the things that I think is that I really look at, and I would tell people, from looking for a job, is your resume. Your resume is you. And now you send those resumes a lot through job applications. Well, you've got to be able to put things in there that are going to make you pop. So I really look at the resume. I want to make sure there's no hidden jobs. I really try to compare it to LinkedIn. You'd be surprised. A lot of people, their LinkedIn profile and their resume doesn't match. I'm still an old school where no more than 2 jobs in the last 5 years. COVID has put a little bit of a wrinkle in that.
Sure.
So that's, I think one is the resume, their LinkedIn. Other thing is just on the phone. If I don't hear somebody smile on the phone when I'm interviewing them, I like people that are very people oriented and they're focused on guests and team. Like Sandy and Robert preached, it was guests, teams, profit. And I focus on those first two, and that's what I focus on. But I think the biggest thing that I look at in the resume or talking to them is, do they have specific hardcore examples of how they've moved the needle? Okay, well, I increased sales. Okay, well, how much did you increase those sales? What did you do to get that? So my advice is, if you're going to do interviews or you're going to have a resume, a lot of things are inherent. So like if you're a restaurant manager, it's inherent that you work the floor, you do this. What I like to see on there is, I worked in a restaurant, did $4 million. I increased sales 20% over my tenure. My employee turnover is under 30%. Real tangible things that can express you on a resume when you apply to a job. You can explain those things on an interview, but to get the interview, you've got to have a resume that pops. So resume, positiveness, and that they've moved the needle.
Is part of it your gut? What your gut tells you when you interview somebody? I've always all my life I went by gut, and it's the person I'm talking to. If I'm on a restaurant visit and I'm listening to a GM or an area director talk or whatever it is, what is my gut telling me?
Right.
You know.
And what I do as a headhunter is I interview them, and if I think they're a candidate, I will coach them now through the process. So if you're out there looking for a job, I definitely think that you should get a recruiter to work with you, because if you haven't been out there a lot and you haven't interviewed a lot, I think working with a headhunter is good, because I coach them. So like if I think that have you ever had a person you ask a question to and they don't answer it 15 minutes later?
Sure.
So if I'm on a phone with somebody that rambles, I very nicely say, you don't want to ramble. I tell people, and this is when I used to do speeches when I was in high school. I don't know if you remember, I'd have a little 3x5 card
Sure.
that would keep me on track. What I tell my candidates, what I'll tell you, if you're going to do an interview, print off a copy of your resume, because that's what they're going to be looking at. And I'm talking about a phone interview or a Zoom interview.
Right.
And highlight the things that you want to get across, and bullet out some things that you want to get across in the interview. It will keep you on track, but also you will be able to say, and then on the back of it, write some questions that you want to ask. You don't want to get off an interview and say, I should have asked this and I should have said this about myself. If you prepare for the interview, you write some notes, you've got something to go back on, your interview will be great, and you'll get off the phone and say, I aced it.
Right. Good information. You mentioned Eric Paul a little while ago. Who are your mentors, Ed, besides Eric?
Well, I think they kind of changed in each stage of my career with Ruby's. I mean, of course, with restaurant operations, it was Sandy and Robert, but also Eric Paul, who was my regional vice president. When I first started in Tuscaloosa, he was my director, and kind of followed him. I worked a little bit with Lee Wallace, who was his counterpart. But, those three operationally were probably the people that, I worked with the most. In HR and training, same people. Eric took over HR when I took over training, and then eventually Sherry Turner, who I think really changed the way we did HR and made it more modernization. And then in the franchise side, still Eric, because Eric became a franchisee. But also, I don't know if you remember, Jerry Ruda.
Sure.
I told was a fellow partner, and I asked him a lot of questions about franchising. He was I told him I was going to say yesterday that he was my mentor, and he's like, what the hell? I said, yeah, you wouldn't be surprised. I was asking you all sorts of questions about equipment and land, and you were very helpful. So
those are great. Eric Paul was great. Bob Baldini was great.
Oh yeah, Bob was good.
Wallace, I worked for Wallace for a while, and he and Dan Bettis were the two people that really kind of, for me, helped make career. But lots of folks at Ruby Tuesday that helped both of us and a ton of other people as well.
Back in the early days, Gary Gallagher was very good operationally. But I would say the person that probably looked out the most for my career was Eric Paul with Robert and Sandy.
That's great.
So
Absolutely. What would be if you had one biggest moment of success or biggest thing to hang your hat on for your career? What would that be, Ed?
I would tell, kind of going back to what we say, I would say that, and I deal with this a lot with people that have lost their job. I dealt with a lot of coming out of COVID, lost their jobs. And my answer to them was when one door closes, you end that chapter of your life, a new door opens. And I went through this with the restructuring. When I got that job was eliminated, I was like, what am I going to do? And I thought it was the worst thing that ever happened in my life. But then the door opened into corporate support that I pushed open and created it. So I would say that was a moment in my success that it was a bad thing, but I turned it into a good thing. And then eventually I led the way for, like I talked about, other people to come into support.
Great. And you never know how it happens. The job I have today, working for a service company, came about because I was doing a podcast with the CEO, and we had never met. And he did two with me. He did one when COVID first started, and we talked about facility managers and so on and what was going on and things like that. And then we had a second one after I had been let go from the company I was working with because they were up in the mountains here in East Tennessee. It's all tourists. There's no tourists. There's no business.
Right.
There's nothing. Obviously, there's no facility need, and they have to make cuts to manage their business. And so I came back on, and he had another podcast with me, and I did it. And we talked about what happens, when you lose a job and how you handle it the right way and what you do and so on. And got a call from him a couple months after that, and just in conversation said, do you want to go to work for me? And I'm like, well, you're in Arizona and I'm not moving, and so we talked about that. And then he said, no, you can work remotely and so on. And he said, all the people. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, everybody. So
You do?
I said, you want my Rolodex? And he said, no, I don't want your Rolodex. I want to learn how you got it. And I thought that was very interesting. So,
well, that's one of the things that I deal with, and I don't know who the CEO is, but I think to be successful in any business, you need to hire people that are smarter than you. You need to hire people that, that can help you grow your business. I have a lot of people that are afraid to hire those people because they think they'll take their job. An example would be Bob Baldini. You remember we hired him and he was a GM. And then all of a sudden he's a VP, but Robert hired him because we needed somebody that had great experience and his days in steak and ale and all that kind of stuff. And, that was a great hire. But if anybody that hired him felt that, they were afraid they'd lose their job, Bob Baldini may not be with us, may never have been with us.
Very true. I was always taught you teach your team, you try to, everybody on your team to be better than you are. And that's the ultimate goal. Like Kevin Carringer went to work for us in facilities. Kevin worked for me. Kevin Carringer now runs Olive Garden for Olive Darden.
Right.
Kevin's a great facility manager. I've learned as much from him as the other way around. And that was the goal, is to teach people and help them along, so that someday they do it better than
And that's the great part of working with people and whatever business you're in. Like my son is, we're starting to look at colleges and he's thinking about careers. And I said, whatever you do, wherever you go, if you're going to move up, you're eventually going to be working with a team and you're going to be supervising people. And you need to remember that you cannot avoid it. You cannot avoid it. And, I think it's something that can be learned and interacting with people and stuff like that. So
absolutely. On the other side of the coin, what's one thing you'd like to have a do-over for? Some people say nothing. I just do what I did, and if it didn't work, it didn't work. But anything you'd like to have a do-over on?
Well, I'm going to give you a particular moment in time. It was when I went into HR and training, and Robert and Sandy had tasked me with creating this corporate university. And I was in some sort of a meeting. It was my first meeting with Sandy. And he was sitting there and talking. I was listening to him. And I'll always remember this. He looked at me and he said, Ed, do you think you might want to write some of this stuff down? And from then on, whenever I came into a meeting with him and with anybody, I had my pad down and I was writing notes. And that's one thing I wish I could do over that particular moment. But it was a very, I mean, I still to this day, when I walk in and nobody's got, notes, something to make notes, I'm like, hey, we need to make sure we're taking notes today. But Sandy probably never remembers that, but it was like branded in my body that would be one thing. That's kind of a funny thing.
That's great. I think that's why we had all those little books that we carried around that you got from the training department. It was little notebooks and little pad, right, things like that, so that wherever you went, you weren't carrying this big notepad. Well,
I always remember when I think Wallace said he had a meeting with, remember Ray Manning, who was a VP, wasn't he VP at one time? Yes. Or regional. This was back when they got the Blackberries, when we started getting Blackberries. And Lee came out and I met him in the hall. He said, I've never gone through that in something in my life. He said, what? He said, Ray was sitting there on his Blackberry typing all these notes, and he never looked at me the whole time. He was just taking notes. So, but that would be probably my one do-over. I mean, we don't want to go down my first two wives, but
Understand. What's a thought or slogan? What's something that you try to live by every day? Just something that kind of, it's either a thought or it's something that you work toward every day. What's
let me think here. I would probably say it's not necessarily a quote, but surround yourself with, positive mindset people. I don't like to associate myself with positive, with people that are not positive. One of my mentors at Gecko Hospitality is the founder, Robert McClanagan, and, not Robert McClanagan. It's oh my God, Robert Kurzak. And we were at a meeting this last year, and at the end of it, he was talking about what he's going to do. And he said, I got myself trapped into surrounding myself with negative people. And he said, I will never do that again. He said, I only associate myself with positive people, positive thinkers, and are not set in their ways. They can deal with change. But I try to do that. I mean, the old quote from Sandy, we're twice as good as we were and half as good as we could be. You remember that quote?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've shared that with my boss, and he has used it in conversations, twice as good as we used to be and only half as good as we can be.
Yeah. So I try to surround myself with positive people and do that. And remember, things are going to change and you got to be flexible. And that's kind of what in my business today,
Well, and I think that's one of the things that helped Ruby's as we were all growing up and going through it was we didn't necessarily have yes people. I mean, you followed orders at the end of the day, but opinions were valued. And there were lots of push, on different items and so on, and everyone got to speak their piece. And what you didn't have were what I called yes people. Shake your head because I told you to, no, that's not right, and so on. And I remember when Kimberly got promoted and took Robert's spot. And one of the things we talked about, and she said one time, she said, the value you help me with is you will tell me what I need to know, not necessarily what I want to know. If you don't agree, you're going to tell me. Now, I get more votes, so at the end of the day, I may say, okay, I heard you, but I'm still going to do it. And you'll go do what I'm asking you to.
And that's a good thing, like with the two organizations I've worked with Ruby's and now with Gecko, is I think if you create an atmosphere where you get everybody's opinion, but in the end of the day, if you decide, if your boss or whoever's making the decision, and what I tell people is I've got recruiters that work for me, and I'll listen to them And I said, let me let you understand, I'm the one that's going to make this decision. And you need to give me advice. But at the end of the day, the direction that I decide to go into, or Gecko or Ruby Tuesday, we all need to support it.
Mm-hmm.
Even though whether you don't support it or not. It used to kill me when I was like a director, and we'd doing a menu change, and I'd hear one of my GMs say, well, they decided to do this. I didn't agree with it. And I'd have to pull them off to the side and say, hey, listen, that's not projecting a positive attitude. No, maybe it's not the way you want it done, but we've all got to take the hill together.
Sure.
So let's not bring anybody else down. Let's just follow the direction and get to the top of the hill.
And I think most people are good with that. I was always good with that. I want to share my opinion if I don't agree. As long as I get to do that, if it doesn't turn out and we go another direction, I'm fine with that. I'll do it. And because that's my order, but I get the opportunity. I think where people get, sideways is when that opportunity never presents itself. As long as most people, not everybody, but most people, as long as you get that opportunity to speak, most people are fine with it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Ed, I certainly appreciate your time today, talking a little bit. Like I said, we've known each other for a really long time, and it's been really good to kind of catch up, hear what you're doing and so on. And for our folks, some great points there. If you are looking for a job and you haven't done it in a while, to use a recruiter or somebody like that to help you along. You could be like me. I had one job for 35 years, and then all of a sudden you don't. And you haven't been on the market in a very long time. And, I could have used probably some help.
The one other advice that I would give you, and as people have left Ruby Tuesday or other organizations that I know, they've usually called me and they'll say, and you may have gone through this, is they'll tell me and say, okay, listen, I make $150,000. I need to make $150,000. And I say, okay, well, if that's what you need. It may be above the market. It may be below it, whatever it is. But then some of them have called me 6 months later and said, Ed, I can't get a job. I've lowered my salary and I will now accept 120. I said, okay. What I tell candidates is when you get out on that interview trail, think of what you need 6 months down the road if you don't have a job. Because if you start off at 150 or whatever that salary is, and you're not going to get it, well, that job's probably not going to be around in 3 or 4 months. So really think about things like relocation. Really think about things like remote, hybrid, things that have come out now. And really think about your salary. And if it would change or move, I have a lot of candidates like, I don't want to ramble here, but I think it's a good point, where I'll say, okay, the job's going to pay $100,000, up to $100,000. Okay, well, I want $100,000. I said, well, you don't fit all the requirements. Well, I still want $100,000 because that's what you have it advertised at. I said, okay, but let me tell you this. If I think you're probably more 90, but I'll present you at 100. But if they come back to me and they say, that's too much money for your experience, and then you come back to me and say, oh, I'll take 90, it's not going to happen. They're not going to interview you because you're wishy-washy. So really think about what's important to you in your life. And if that's what you need, that's what you need. But would that change if you're 6 months or 4 months down the road, you don't have a job? Think about that when you're looking.
Sure. Great advice. Great advice. So, well, thank you.
Okay.
I certainly appreciate it. It's great catching up, and lots of good thoughts for our listeners today. We look forward to speaking with you again on a future FM Corner.
Right.
Thank you.
And I'm excited that my dogs didn't bark through this whole thing. So
that's great. Thanks, Ed.
See you later.
Okay. See you.